Inner Fire Ally is currently one of the strongest builds in the entire game, and while it might look easy on the outside, in fact it has a complex rotation, and you need to synchronize many different mechanics to maximize your damage and your survivability as well. There is quite a lot to learn here, so just stay a while and listen. In this section, I'll cover all the basic information you need to get started with the build, without going into too much detail on how to max out everything. If you are someone who's already familiar with the base setup, then just feel free to skip ahead to the advanced section using the timestamps below. The core of all Ina pushing builds starts of course with the 6-piece of the Ina set, with Bindings of the Lesser Gods and the Crudest Boots. Having only these items will already allow you to destroy lower tier content in the game, but of course there are quite a few more damage multipliers we can add to the party, starting with our weaponry. The Shenlong set will give us a massive 350% extra damage each time we nuke, while the Flying Dragon in the cube will also give us double damage, given it decides to proc. Additional multipliers coming from our jewelry, with the Endless Walk set giving us an up to 100% extra damage, and of course the triple damage provided by the convention of elements during its fire cycle. And if it wasn't enough, we still get massive buffs from our shards, with the Sliver of Terror in our helm and the Dregs of Lives in our weapon. The upside of this build is that on top of the huge damage, we are still very tanky, since besides the toughness coming from our 6-piece of Inas, we also have the Lefebvre Soliloquy on our shoulder slot, the Spirit Guards on our bracer slot, while we also get a huge toughness buff from the Endless Walk set and the Sliver of Terror helm shard. As for our stat priority, the most important thing that you have to keep in mind is to have at least 33% cooldown reduction, or otherwise you won't be able to press your Mystic Ally on each of your fire cycles. You can easily achieve this by just having a single cooldown reduction roll on your gear on top of the CDR coming from your Enchantress. But of course, having a bit more CDR doesn't hurt at all, since it will give you a lot more flexibility during your nuke phase, but that is for the advanced section. Another somewhat important thing to keep in mind is to try to avoid extra spirit rolls on your gear, as they might make it a bit harder for you to manage your Shenlong buff. The general guideline for our offensive stats is to try to fit in fire and Mystic Ally damage everywhere you can, prioritize critical hit chance over critical hit damage, and generally do not worry too much about having attack speed rolls on your gear. As for our defense, it is recommended to hit roughly 1 million HP, try to fit in all resistance rolls everywhere you can, while also keeping an eye out for secondary resistance and ranged or melee damage reduction rolls. As for Paragon point allocation, just put as many points as you need on Vitality to hit roughly 1 million HP, and then simply dump the rest on Dexterity, and of course do not put any points on Max Spirit. We use the Enchantress as our follower this time around, simply because of how much utility, defense and also damage she gives us, especially when used with the all-skill follower item. The key items on our follower are the Flavor of Time amulet and the Nemesis bracers, that will allow us to get the most out of the pylons we find. Our first goal when gearing our follower is to hit 25k main stat that will maximize her abilities. And since we are running the all-skill follower item, we also need to make sure that she can survive. The easiest way to give a huge toughness buff to your follower is to equip a maxed out Mutilation Guard and Esoteric Alteration gem on them, while of course adding a few augments doesn't hurt either. You also need to make sure that she has a few life on hit and life per second rolls so she can sustain herself. Giving a single CC item to your follower isn't a bad idea either, since she will constantly interrupt the Rift Guardian and will make the fight much easier for you. In this section, we will add our skills one by one, while also building up our rotation. So our first and most important skill is Mystic Ally with the Fire Ally rune. This is our only skill that deals damage, and while your Mystic Allies can scratch enemies here and there with their boxing and kicking around, it is the explosions that will do the heavy lifting for us. Pressing the Mystic Ally button will make your allies to try and explode on their target of choice over a roughly 1 second period. The explosions deal huge damage but with a very small radius, and this is where our next skill comes in place. Cyclone Strike will allow us to group up monsters for our explosions, while it also procs the damage from our bracers and the toughness from our shoulders. The most basic rotation is to just wait for your fire cycle, then Cyclone Strike mobs on top of yourself, and then press the Mystic Ally button. We use Way of the 100 Fists with the Assimilation rune for a number of reasons. First, it will give us a nice damage buff that further increases with better mob density. It also procs our Spirit Guards for the extra toughness, while it makes managing our spirit for the Shenlong buff possible. So now we can add our generator into the rotation. But first let's talk a bit about the Shenlong set. We only care about the second part of the set, with the 350% global multiplier, which activates each time we hit maximum spirit and deactivates when we hit 0 spirit. It is important therefore to either hit maximum spirit before your nuke or by pressing the Mystic Ally button and gaining the 200 spirit. The easiest way to ensure that you'll have the buff for your nuke is to only hit maximum spirit a few seconds before you're about to press your Mystic Ally button. By holding down your generator, you'll be able to maintain the buff until your allies are ready to go boom. And this is the primary way you use your generator. You just simply keep on attacking into the middle of the monsters until your allies explode. Our only mobility skill with this build is Dashing Strike with the Blinding Speed rune, which also provides us a nice toughness buff through increased dodge chance. Use this skill to cover distance and to avoid dangerous situations, and also to get into position before your nuke. And now to add this to our rotation, simply use the skill to jump inside a pack of monsters when you get close to your fire cycle, use Cyclone Strike while holding down your generator, and then press the Mystic Ally button and go boom. Serenity with the Ascension rune is our main protective ability when we try to set up our nuke. It can work as a panic button too, but you should only use it like that if you are 100% certain that otherwise you will die. So now when we jump inside the mob pack, we can also protect ourselves with Serenity. And our last active skill is Inner Sanctuary with the Temple of Protection rune. The main purpose of this skill is to ease out our damage phase, with giving us a bit of extra time when we are more or less protected before we press our Mystic Ally button. Adding this to our rotation, when you see that your Serenity is about to expire, then first press Inner Sanctuary and then follow with Cyclone Striking and pressing the Mystic Ally button. Before we go over an example situation, first a few words about our passive skill choices. Beacon of Ether and Seize the Initiative are the two skills that you should always use because of how powerful they are. The other two slots depend on whether you need more damage or more toughness instead, with a number of equally powerful choices. So now we have a basic understanding on how to use our skills, but we still need to specify exactly when to use them. Convention of elements is our clock in the rift, and it generally determines when to go on an offense or a defense. We have an additional mechanic that is tied to time, and that is the Endless Walk set. It takes it 5 seconds to fully shift from 50% damage reduction to 100% damage done, which we of course want to reach when our allies explode. This means that we need to stand in place for at least 5 seconds prior to pressing the Mystic Ally button. So keeping this in mind, our rotation looks like this. During our Holy and Lightning cycles, we just run around and try to herd mobs, stopping only for a single Cyclone Strike and Generator attack to keep up our toughness buffs. By alternating between the Cyclone Strike and Generator attacks, you will ensure that you'll only hit maximum spirit once you stop for your nuke. Around 2 seconds into your physical cycle is when you should start to look for a suitable place to set up your nuke. Use Dashing Strike to get into position, and then press Cyclone Strike to pull mobs on yourself. Once you are surrounded by enemies, you should immediately press your Serenity and start attacking with your Generator. This is when you should get your Shenlong buff, which you will easily maintain until your nuke if you keep on attacking with your Generator. At the last second of Serenity, drop Inner Sanctuary under yourself. As your convention shifts to fire, press Cyclone Strike followed by Mystic Ally. Once your allies are done exploding, then you can start moving again. You can let your spirit to completely deplete at this point, while you try to herd mobs for your next nuke. Just keep repeating this rotation for the entire rift, which includes the Rift Guardian as well. When fighting the Rift Guardian, you constantly want to attack because you would like to stack your Stricken, and that's the only difference. And with this, we have covered everything there is to know on the basic level. This is the section when we try to max out the build's potential using all the little tricks there are to clear the highest possible rift. So what we want upon the basic rotation is a higher Flying Dragon uptime, more Dregs of Lights stacks, and a better pathfinding for our Mystic Allies when they go boom. Let's just start with a quick explanation on why it is so important to start with Serenity and then Inner Sanctuary, and not the other way around. Serenity doesn't start its cooldown as long as its effect is in place. Therefore, we only get the extra damage from the Sliver of Terror shard once Serenity wears off, and obviously this is when we want our allies to explode. By using Inner Sanctuary second, we have a longer safe period to place our nuke when we have all our abilities on a cooldown and also a high enough toughness to survive. Technically, we have a roughly 3 seconds window to press our Mystic Ally button. That is from the last second of cold to around 2 seconds into fire, since it can take over a second for all our allies to blow up. And now that we know the time we have, we need to decide exactly when to press our Mystic Ally. Flying Dragon has a 4% chance to proc on any action you take, with a 5 seconds internal cooldown and a 7 seconds duration. It gives us a massive 5 tiers of extra damage, so it is quite important to have it up when our allies go boom. The easiest way to verify that you have an active Flying Dragon is to open your inventory to check for your sheet damage when you get close to your fire cycle. If you see that it's doubled, it means that you have an active flying dragon. The general rule of thumb is if you feel it's active but have no idea when it procced, then just simply press your Mystic Ally the earliest you can as your fire cycle comes, simply because we don't want to risk dropping the buff. If it isn't active, however, then just keep on attacking with your generator for a few more seconds. This way you'll have a bit of extra chance to get the proc, but be aware that you need to press the button 2 seconds into your fire cycle or your allies might not explode in time. The tricky part comes when we try to synchronize this with our Dregs of Light's stacks. In general, when you are moving around, you get fewer stacks because your allies are less likely to hit something. This also means that when you stop, you start to get your stacks much more rapidly. If you do the rotation correctly, then it is highly likely that you will get the peak somewhere around your fire cycle. Rule of thumb number 2 is if you see that you are about to hit your peak during your fire cycle, then just immediately press your Mystic Ally. This is the safest way to do your nuke phase. If you have a Flying Dragon proc, then do not bother with your Dregs of Light stacks and just nuke. On the other hand, if your Dregs of Light is at its peak, then do not bother with Flying Dragon and just nuke. And now the hard part. If you don't have a Flying Dragon proc, or you are certain that it proc just now, and you also see that your stacks are climbing, then you can wait a few more seconds before you press the Mystic Ally button. You always need to evaluate the situation and make a decision according to that. And now you understand why it is so important to have safety when you're trying to make up your mind. Your Mystic Allies have a hard time with pathfinding if the density is too big and or the targets are static, which can easily result in half of your allies not exploding at all. In order to improve the odds of our allies going off, we need to shake up the pool. The way to do it is when you see that your explosions are going off, then simply start slightly moving around while spamming your Cyclone Strike. If you do it like this, your allies will explode much more reliably, and you will also pull in new monsters into the continuous explosions, which can further increase the damage you deal with each of your cycles. And this is one of the reasons why I chose the Lightning Rune for my Cyclone Strike during my push, because it allowed me to press Cyclone Strike at will, despite the Shenlong Drain. And now just a few additional tips for better survivability. You don't want to spend more time in the enemy's company than you have to for your nuke. This means that once your allies have exploded, you quickly want to get away from your pool and basically start kiting the remaining mobs while you add a few fresh ones into your pool just to keep up a decent density. Be ready to use your Cyclone Strike simply to CC enemies. It is practically a stun for smaller mob types. So if you see that you are about to be slapped or you'll get something thrown into your face, then be ready to press your Cyclone Strike and get a quick interrupt. Always try to keep in mind that your allies tank enemies for you, which also means that they can block most enemy projectiles. Therefore, hiding behind them is often a good strategy to survive. If you want to spice things up a little, then there are a few additional variants that you can try. Probably the most widespread version is to run an Aughild set. This variant does a lot more damage, but in return it's also much squishier. The general playstyle with this mainly remains the same, you just need to be much more careful with how you rotate your defenses. Since a single minor slip in the rotation can get you instantly killed, I wouldn't recommend this version if you are playing hardcore or just starting out with enough pushing. If you really don't like using Shenlongs, then it is good news for you, because you don't have to. The Daibo setup that I ran is only slightly weaker than the base Shenlong version, which means that you can easily get 150 clear with it, even sub 2k paragons. So the main difference is that we no longer need to play the Shenlong minigame, but we have a squirts buff that we always need to keep an eye out for. We also run a focus and restraint instead of the endless walk set, while having extra attack speed rolls on our gear is also much more desirable here, since otherwise we have a harder time to stack our Stricken and to get a Flying Dragon proc, since we run a much slower weapon. The rotation itself is also quite different with this setup. We are moving around and trying to hurt mobs during our Holy and Lightning cycles just the same. But we keep doing this until like 1 second into our cold cycle, while we also try to avoid taking any hits during this period to preserve our skirts buff. By keeping your distance from the enemies, you can also manage your Dregs of Light stacks much better. Your allies are following you wherever you go, which means that we can increase the rate at which we gain our Dregs of Light stacks by moving closer to enemies, or decrease it by moving further away. You ideally should have around an 80 stack when your cold cycle comes. Speaking of cold cycle, when you are around a second into it is when to pop your Serenity and jump inside the middle of your pool. There are 2 possible scenarios after this. If you see that your pool is very dangerous and you will likely drop your skirts instantly after your Serenity wears off, then as soon as your fire cycle comes, press Cyclone Strike followed by Blinding Flash and Mystic Ally. This way you will be completely protected during your nuke and you'll still have time to dash away safely. But if the pool isn't dangerous, however, like you are fighting a bunch of melee trash mobs, you can wait with your nuke until your Serenity wears off, and this way you will have a bit of extra damage coming in from the Sliver of Terror shard. There is an additional way to play with the Daibo, and that is to use the Captain Crimson set. The version that I use stacks high CDR and doesn't run a convention. And this results in a very straightforward but also active playstyle. We aim for frequent but smaller nukes when we jump inside our pool with our Serenity up, followed by the usual Cyclone Strike, Blinding Flash and Mystic Ally combo. We are quite mobile with this build thanks to the low cooldown on our Dashing Strike, which also means that it is generally worth it to try to jump into Oculus Ring procs while your allies are continuously going off. You still should have a charge to escape after that. This isn't exactly a tanky build, which means that you should try your best to avoid taking hits between your nukes, which is of course also important to preserve your skirts buff. And with this we have reached the end of this guide. There are still a few additional tips that I added into the description. And of course there are a bunch of pushing videos on my channel that you can check out if you are interested. If you have additional questions, then just leave them down in the comments below, and I do my best to give you an answer. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, then you can help me out by hitting the like and the subscribe buttons. See you next time.